Now, I understand it's very hard for most people to get up salt, and I found myself an alternative. It's called, hi friends, can you believe that this white powder is why people gain or lose weight? And no, it's not sugar. This, however, was once worth its weight in gold. And would you believe that just an extra teaspoon can make you retain 2 pounds of water weight? Now, this is a food industry's secret ingredient and the single most important ingredient when it comes to your weight gain, water retention, and health. This is also how food companies introduce other chemical additives and how they trick your brain to eat whatever they create to make them trillions of dollars. Literally, nations have fought over the rights to own this essential nutrient that does wonders when it comes to weight gain or weight loss. I've seen people drop 20 to 30 pounds within a matter of days just by making people get rid of this from their body. Unfortunately, medicines can mess with the natural balance, which affects your energy and fitness. Now, if you've ever felt bloated or swollen, maybe it's because you're eating too much of this. And when you eat too much of this, you store excess water in the wrong places. Obviously, this is a salt. But what kind is it? I have here kosher salt, magnesium salt, potassium salt, Himalayan salt, iodinized salt, and this just so happens to be sea salt. Now, all of these may taste different, and some of these actually have different ingredients, which will affect your body in different ways. And chances are you're consuming one of these salts in excess, and at least one, if not two of these salts are severely missing in your diet, especially if you're eating the standard American diet. That is shaving your health and longevity and causing you to gain weight. The key to losing healthy weight is to achieve a healthy sodium to potassium balance. And for every gram of sodium, people should be eating about 4 grams, if not at least 2 grams of potassium. And currently, the average American diet is so skewed on the sodium and so little on the potassium. The problem is also similar to magnesium. We're eating so little magnesium. Does this mean you should just go and eat teaspoons and tablespoons of salt to meet your ratios? Absolutely not. This is because added salt messes with your water balance. Now, I have here sea salt. This is basically evaporated seawater and you're left with sodium chloride. This is about 105 grams of sodium chloride. Now, this entire amount is approximately the total amount of sodium chloride that is in your entire body. And I'm sure you just don't eat spoonfuls of salt, but you probably do add some of the salt to your food. Now, if the food is full of water, then the salt dissolves in water to become separate sodium and chloride ions. And you probably salt your food because it simply tastes better. I honestly don't like adding salt to my food, but I will add salt to the food when I cook for my family. However, they don't think I ever put enough salt. And this is because they're used to eating saltier foods. They have trained their palate, their salt palate, to require more salt. That's natural. Our brains all seek the taste of salt, but this isn't a fixed trait. Salt enhances the perception of other flavors, such as sweetness, and suppresses bitterness, which is why it is so widely used in cooking and why people would actually add salt to desserts, pastries and breads, vegetables and meats. I always found it quite strange that people would add salt to desserts like chocolate or caramel or cookies, but apparently salt truly does enhance the complexity of flavors and prevents desserts from being overly sweet. All of this is happening on the real estate called your tongue that has taste receptors. These taste receptors interact with salt through ion channels like the epithelial sodium channels. Now you have 5 classic basic taste qualities: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, umami, or savory. Now, how much you taste also depends on the health of your tongue and how well you smell. And when you lose your taste buds on the top of your tongue, or if you lose your sense of smell, you will also lose your taste and then lose your appetite. But your taste is also dependent upon your saliva. Without normal saliva, your taste actually rapidly declines because salt, sugar, and spices they need to dissolve in the saliva to interact with your taste receptors. Stick out your tongue and see whether or not your tongue is a normal color. If it's a shade of white, black, or bright red, that's abnormal. Please see your doctor, unless you just ate some food that was that color. The discoloration can indicate an underlying medical condition or an infectious condition that can prevent you from tasting properly. And therefore, you may be consuming more salt than you actually need to salt your food, which will definitely add pounds to your weight. Now, most people, they eat a ton more salt than they need because they eat a lot of salt regularly every day. And regular consumption of high sodium foods, that desensitizes the epithelial sodium channel receptors, making your taste less sensitive to salt, and hence you require more sodium chloride or table salt to taste the salt. Now, this leads to a preference for saltier foods. And if you want to take a break from adding salt or salted foods, then you can either just quit it cold turkey, or you need to distract your senses. And that is one excellent way to reduce salt. You can enhance the flavor of your food through other seasonings, such as garlic, onion, lemon, vinegar, herbs, and spices. This adds a complexity to the taste that can distract your mind from craving more salt. Now, people are also trying to add more salt to their food because today our food quality is pretty poor. Even our all-natural foods taste pretty bland due to our massive farming practices. Tomatoes no longer are fragrant and chickens taste like cardboard. And hence, you need more salt to make it palatable. And I'm not surprised. If Americans, they eat 1 million chickens an hour, what are they feeding chickens that can make them grow so fast? And you can bet that chicken that you're eating today is not fed the same as the chickens that your grandmother ate 50 years ago. Hence, that's an excellent way to reduce sodium, is to start by buying and eating good quality food, whole foods that are grown with care. Now, another way to reduce sodium is to replace the sodium with another salty taste like potassium. Unless you have kidney issues, then you should work with your provider because you may have to cut down on both sodium and potassium to maintain your electrolyte and water balance. And in case you're wondering, it is an intentional act that the engineered foods today are manipulated with salt to make cardboard food taste better. For example, take corn on the cob, a naturally sweet, fragrant food with texture. And many people love corn and can eat it plain. I certainly can. But once you process the corn and make it into like corn chip or masa, then you have to do more to get people to eat it. In fact, Doritos, they almost went out of business as a simple plain corn chip until they exploded by adding chemical flavoring with salt. 20 years ago, my husband came home with our first bottle of sea salt, and he said, we should use this salt because it tastes better. Now, personally, I can't taste the difference between any of these salts. However, I went along because I figured it was all natural from the ocean. Have you ever tasted ocean water? I have. As a kid, my parents used to take us to the pier at Marina del Rey at 4 a.m. in the morning because they love fishing. Actually, they would wake me up at 3:30 in the morning. My dad would basically have to carry me into the car because I was just not awake. And when we arrived at the pier, all I wanted to do was sit and go back to sleep. But I would sleepily walk down the pier in the dark. Mind you, it was 4 a.m. in the morning. And then I would set up my beach chair and I would just sit there, bored out of my wits. And the only thing I would do was I ate snacks, processed foods, sat there and watched my dad and my brothers fish. But my favorite part of going fishing was to watch the sun come up because I wanted to play in the water. And a couple of times I actually swallowed some of that ocean water. And boy, was it salty. Drinking seawater is actually quite harmful because the salt exceeds what the human body can safely process. Now, your kidney would have to produce urine with a lower salinity than seawater, which requires more water. To compensate, the body actually pulls water from your cells, so you actually will get more dehydrated if you drink salty water. The reality is, many of your foods that you eat it's actually quite salty and sometimes can approach the salinity of sea. Now, for example, you can drink a can of soup or eat a frozen meal, and you're basically eating an equivalent of 1,200 milligrams of salt. And if you drank less than a cup of liquid with that food, your concentration of what you ate would be around 3% sodium salt. And that's why it's good to drink more water if you're eating more salt. I once saw a TikTok video where they took a large bag of potato chips, which is over 1,120 milligrams of sodium, and they made it into a tiny cup of mashed potatoes. Well, if you ate that and didn't drink any water, you would have exceeded the salinity of ocean water. And quickly, you can see how your sodium would add up to strain your kidneys to cause dehydration, while at the same time, elevate high blood pressure. Did you know that if you removed all the water from the ocean and spread the salt evenly over the land of the earth, you would have a layer of salt that's 500 feet thick, equivalent to a 40-story office building. Now, I always wondered why sea salt was so special. And apparently, it's because sea salt is contaminated with plastic, because that's what we've been dumping in our oceans. So if you don't want to plasticize yourself, you may want to reconsider using sea salt and plastic water bottles. Have you ever tried pink Himalayan salt? Did you know that Himalayan salt, it's not actually from the Himalayan mountains, but are mined in Pakistan? I have to admit, this is a pretty pink color, and you get that pinkness from trace amounts of iron oxide. Now, Himalayan salt also has trace amounts of other minerals like magnesium, potassium, and calcium. But in reality, there's really so little of it that it doesn't make any clinical difference. So if you're deficient in magnesium or potassium, this is not the way to do it. Now, when my kids were small, we used to take them to the mall and they loved the pretzels. And I would buy them some pretzels, but I would always pick the ones without those giant salt crystals. A few times though, I had to buy ones with salt because they ran out of the saltless ones. But I would pick out those giant crystals of salt. Those coarse, large salt crystals, they were called coarse salt. And they had a larger crystalline structure, a rougher texture, and really they don't dissolve as quickly. So they're great to use to season meats and finish dishes because some people just like that taste of salt. Later on, my husband came back home with kosher salts. And I noticed that kosher salts were large, flat, and flaky, which makes them easier to sprinkle. Now, kosher salt supposedly is a cleaner, pure salt flavor without any additives. When you're eating highly processed foods, most likely you're getting sodium in various forms. Now, this deli meat has sodium in the form of sea salt as well as sodium phosphate. Now, this one has sodium nitrate, sodium chloride, and sodium phosphate. In case you didn't know, all these sodiums add up to your total sodium burden and can contribute to your taste preference to salt. And when you stop eating sodium whatever in your processed foods, your epithelial sodium channel receptors will become more sensitive. And this allows the same level of saltiness to be perceived from smaller amounts of sodium. Have you ever cooked for anybody whose first reflex when you serve them their food was to add salt or add soy sauce? I had a roommate like that who did just that before she even tasted the food. She had a strong salt palate, and the amount of salt you crave is really based on how you're raised or how you continue to live. But you can retrain your salt palate within a matter of 2 months. And once you start giving up the salt, you'll notice that when you go back to the foods you eat, you won't enjoy them as much. They will be way too salty. But if you constantly eat out, or if you eat pre-made takeout foods, they will be saltier because there's no way they can sell you the product unless they add more salt. Salt, it doesn't just enhance flavors, it also masks undesirable tastes, which is one reason why it's so widely used. Now, have you noticed that bitter vegetables, they don't taste as bitter when you eat them at a restaurant, and they also tasted saltier. Not only does salt suppress bitterness by reducing the brain's perception of bitterness, but when sodium interacts with bitter tasting compounds in the food, it can also alter how the taste receptors on the tongue signal bitterness to the brain. So it's very common that chefs will add salt to bitter vegetables like kale, spinach, Brussels sprouts to make them taste less harsh. Have you ever salted your lemon? Salt can reduce the perception of sourness in acidic foods by neutralizing some of the harshness of the acids. In dressings or sauces with vinegar or citrus, a pinch of salt softens a sharp acidic edge. My mom would always add salt to fruits, but I hated it. But I also didn't like the astringent taste of certain fruits like an unripened pomegranate. Astringency is a dry, puckering sensation in the mouth caused by tannins or polyphenols in the foods such as tea, wine, or unripe fruits. This also happens to me when I eat red walnuts. But when you add salt, it can balance and mellow the astringency by enhancing the perception of other flavors in the food and drink. Now, did you know that pre-marinated meats in the supermarkets are generally saltier? Some say that's because they use old meat. Now, old meat is more heavily salted because salt can suppress some of the off flavors from the preservatives or metallic notes in the meats. Salt helps smooth out those undesirable tastes, especially organ meats that have a stronger, kind of gamier flavor. Salt reduces the metallic or bitterness of those foods. And salt enhances the umami taste by interacting with the glutamate compounds in food. Now, so far, we've mostly focused on sodium salt. And it wouldn't be a big deal if the only problem was taste. But salt is big money. What do you think is worth more than $1 trillion or $1 billion? Honestly, I've never even learned how to count that many zeros in my math class, not even in my calculus. My old calculator probably wouldn't even be able to calculate $1 billion. So to me, both numbers are extremely huge, but one is 1,000 times more than the other. Now, the food industry, they make the bigger number, trillions of dollars a year by selling processed foods with sodium salt. And that is causing 18 billion healthcare dollars each year in America and will shave the life expectancy of each of their loyal customers by at least 2 years. Now, salt is no joke. People's love for salt, it runs deep in human history. Countries have fought wars over salts and controlled people, like what happened in China around 6000 BC. Do you get a salary? Did you know that the word salary comes from solarium, a portion of a Roman soldier's wages paid in salt? Controlling salt mines and trade routes was a significant factor in the expansion of the Roman Empire. Now, in Egypt, salt was crucial for mummification and the cornerstone of their Egyptian religious and cultural practices. During the medieval times, Venice established itself as a salt trade hub by controlling salt pans in the Mediterranean. This allowed them to fund their navy and dominate trade routes. In France, Salzburg, which is a modern-day Austria, it had a conflict zone due to salt production. France had a salt tax which made salt very expensive, which promoted smuggling. Now, that tax sparked regional revolts in the 14th century, known as the Salt Wars. And during the French Revolution, I believe salt taxes became a symbol of oppression. Oppression with salt was also what happened to India. The British imposed heavy salt taxes, which restricted Indians from buying salt from British sources. And in 1930, Gandhi led the Salt March by walking 240 miles as he made salt symbolic for the resistance of colonial rule and inspired a global movement. Now, in Africa, salt was so valuable that it was once traded like gold. Now, salt mines were how rulers became wealthy. And in America, the North won the Civil War by destroying Saltville, Virginia, and literally weakened the Southern Army because they couldn't access salt to preserve their food. But did you know that salt was also used to treat goiters? Actually, the salt itself doesn't treat goiters, but it was a great vehicle to attach iodine to cure our goiter belt. Now, at one time, a large part of America's military recruits all had giant necks, but after fortifying salt with iodine, the American government was able to eliminate the goiter belt within 10 years. So this is a salt I would actually prefer to eat if I wanted to get my iodine. And if you're not getting your iodine from either salt, seafood, dairy, or a supplement, then you really should look into that and replace your iodine, which is an essential nutrient.
Hi, friends. I am so thrilled that you want to take charge of your health and take charge of your food. Now, I know nutrition can be complex, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm here to support you in this lifelong journey. So if you point your camera app to this QR code, it'll take you to a link for a free handout that I created just for you. And if you like it, if you want to see other handouts, please go to the link in my show notes, and then you can leave me your feedback on what I could do to help you in your journey. Okay, back to the video now.
Now, to understand why this salt is so valuable, you really have to understand how people use salt and why your body only needs a finite amount of salt. Now, historically, before the invention of refrigerators, this sodium was crucial for preserving food like meats and fish. Have you ever brined a Thanksgiving turkey? Brining is a culinary technique used to enhance flavor, juices, and textures in foods, particularly meats, and involves soaking your food in a saltwater solution. Sometimes you can add sugar, spices, or other aromatics. And then the process relies on osmosis, diffusion, and protein interactions to achieve its effect. Through osmosis, salt in the brine draws moisture out of the food initially, but over time, it allows water and dissolved salts to enter the turkey's cells. In meats, salt breaks down protein structures, allowing moisture retention and the release of savory amino acids, enhancing tenderness and taste. Now, salt, it can disrupt the structure of proteins and muscle fibers, making them more soluble. And this leads to greater water retention during cooking. And this is also the principle why you may feel more swollen the next day, or you get heart failure after celebrating Christmas and New Year's. That food probably had too much salt. And after you eat the sodium, initially you're going to be thirsty. But that sodium, it gets trapped in your tissues, and you will actually retain more water because of it. Sodium can influence how your muscles contract. It also is a critical role in muscle cells and the nerve system. And this is a problem if you already have a muscle that's injured, like your heart. That's called heart failure. Sodium ions are essential for generating and propagating electrical signals called action potentials in these neurons. And these signals can trigger muscle contraction. And in muscle cells, sodium influx is a part of the process that opens voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium ions then flood into the cell, interacting with proteins like troponin and tropomyosin to allow actin and myosin filaments to slide past each other, resulting in contraction. While sodium is essential for muscle contraction, excess sodium intake can disrupt normal function. First of all, excess sodium levels can lead to excess dehydration because the sodium pulls water out of the cells, which affects how your muscle cell hydrates and performs. Severe cases can cause a neuromuscular coordination defect, leading to muscle cramps, weakness, and spasms. That's just sodium. Now let's move on to potassium. Potassium is crucial for counterbalancing sodium's effects on the muscle contraction. A high sodium intake without an adequate potassium intake can impair your muscle function, as potassium helps to reset muscle cells after contraction. And unlike the overconsumption of sodium, most Americans, about 99% of them, they don't eat enough potassium. There's a necessary health ratio called the sodium to potassium ratio that people are missing because they're overeating and overachieving on the sodium level, unlike the potassium level. And potassium has a smaller therapeutic window than sodium. So if you overdo the potassium, it can also lead to heart attacks, strokes, high blood pressure, kidney failure. That's why it's always important to talk to your physician if you have any medical concerns or problems. Unlike sodium, potassium can actually help your blood vessels relax. It also enhances the excretion of sodium and therefore counteracts sodium's blood pressure raising effects. And for every gram of potassium, you can actually decrease your cardiovascular risk by 18%. Now, some people also use salt substitutes, and I'm not sure that this is better than real food. If you are aiming for foods high in potassium, then that's primarily your fruits, vegetables, legumes, and nuts. And when you eat those whole foods, you're getting so many more nutrients that will lower your blood pressure, your weight, and help you to meet 4,700 milligrams per day of potassium. Make sure that you check with your own medical doctor whether you want to put table salt or potassium salt in your foods. Changes in your kidney will significantly impair these two electrolytes. Now, there's also one more salt that I forgot to bring, and that's Epsom salt. Epsom salt is great for the skin, but it's not so good to ingest because it can cause extreme electrolyte disturbances. Epsom salt is made out of magnesium chloride. Magnesium actually comes in several forms, which has different effects on the body with different absorption rates. And in general, when you eat magnesium, you're actually eating one of the most critical minerals in your body because it's responsible for over 300 enzymatic reactions. That includes muscle function, energy production, blood sugar, and blood pressure. And when you eat enough magnesium, that can help you to lower your blood pressure, lower your type 2 diabetes rates, and lower your cardiovascular events. And guess which foods are the richest sources of magnesium? Leafy greens and nuts and seeds. Oh, legumes as well. If that's not your diet, then you may be magnesium deficient and a supplement would greatly benefit you. By eating enough potassium magnesium, you can actually change our healthcare industry, save the government billions of dollars. But it's hard to do that when you're eating hydration drinks full of sodium. In the short term, you may tolerate it, but the long term, probably not going to thrive with it. Unless you're an athlete sweating profusely and you need those electrolytes replaced in real time. If you think about it, a serious athlete works out for hours. And this is important because you're taking a break from eating highly salted foods. And unlike an athlete, most people, they do very little recreational activity, but eat a ton of sodium already for breakfast. But the reality is the average person has other problems besides overeating salt, which comes to over 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day. That definitely exceeds their recommendations. And of course, when you're eating out, that can significantly increase as restaurant meals are often heavily salted. Some single meals have over 3,000 milligrams of sodium. Now, if you consistently ate out all meals, then you could easily push your sodium intake to 6,000 milligrams or more a day, depending on your fast food choices. Fast food and processed foods are particularly high in sodium. And I'm sure you know sodium intake can lead to increased blood pressure. It could be a major risk factor for heart disease and strokes. But you probably don't have high blood pressure, but it may be only high in the doctor's office. Well, if that's the cause, what do you think will happen to you if somebody cuts you off the road while driving, or if you get in an argument with your spouse? So that is the thing. If such a tiny little thing like visiting the doctor will tick up your blood pressure, then so will other tiny little things. Your blood pressure actually changes depending on your level of stress. So if you're going to undergo a fight or flight response, then you got a lot of stress and a lot of hormones are being released ultimately to squeeze your blood pressure to prepare you to fly. And the hormones that are being released are just normal stuff. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, maybe you've heard of adrenaline. They're referring to the same hormones. But when your blood pressure constricts, then you got a problem with blood flow. And if this happens in your digestive system, you can imagine the abdominal pain you would experience. And if under those acute stressful conditions, your blood pressure can top a rise by 20 to 30 points or 20 to 30 millimeters of mercury, then this is actually very normal. But if this is you every day, then the condition becomes chronic. And you may have chronic activation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And the result of chronic high blood pressure is called hypertension. If you think about your blood vessels, should have a wall as flexible as a rubber band. It should be able to expand and collapse. But just like a rubber band, if you keep stretching it, eventually it will break its original shape. This is, in fact, what happens to your blood vessel walls. Over time, the blood vessel may no longer expand and contract. And of course, these are all unpleasant thoughts, but there are thoughts that we should think about and discuss with our children. And keeping that blood flow or maintaining a good blood pressure is super important. There are many ways to address an abnormal blood pressure. You have to lower your salt intake. And in fact, if you stop your processed foods or eating out, you will dramatically reduce your salt intake. And this can translate into better blood pressure within a matter of days. So if you decide to change your diet, then you should work with your physicians ahead of time so that they can safely monitor your blood pressure. If you're on blood pressure medications, it's wise not to just quit cold turkey. Now, I understand it's very hard for most people to give up salt. And I found myself an alternative. It's called miso salt. This is the only sodium that actually has been shown to reduce people's blood pressure. So this is the one that I actually use. And if you want to learn more about miso and its health benefits, watch the next video.